Welcome, everyone. I am Angela Grimes, CEO of Born Free USA, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this discussion of the impact of the primate pet trade on the animals involved, law enforcement, the sanctuaries who care for the victims, and the impact that the trade has on conservation. But before we dive into all of that, I'd like to give you a little background on Born Free USA for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Born Free was founded by Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers, stars of the iconic film Born Free, along with their son, Will Travers. We have become a global organization with programs in numerous countries spanning 5 continents. We believe that wild animals belong in the wild, and we are seeking a future in which humans no longer exploit wild animals, and we're fighting to end the threats that affect not only entire species survival, but also individual lives. These threats include wildlife trafficking, the trapping and fur trades, animals kept in captivity for entertainment, and of course, the subject of today's webinar, the exotic pet trade. We also rescue and care for animals in our sanctuaries around the world, including Born Free USA's primate sanctuary in South Texas. That is home to hundreds of monkeys. Many have been rescued from research labs, private homes, and zoos. At the sanctuary, the team sees firsthand the devastating effects of the pet trade, and they do their best to give rescued monkeys a second chance and the best life possible. But sanctuaries aren't the solution, which is why Born Free USA, along with many of our partners in the animal welfare community, are advocating for comprehensive federal legislation to end the keeping of primates as pets. You'll hear more about that later and how you can help. And finally, before I turn the floor over to our amazing panel, I'd like to invite you to visit bornfreeusa.org to learn more about our work and to make a donation to support our efforts to end animal cruelty. Now, I'd like to introduce our host, Dr. Liz Tyson, Born Free USA Programs Director. Welcome, Dr. Liz.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela. That's great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. I should give the disclaimer, as I do before all of these. I share my home with 3 dogs. I hope they won't make an appearance, but they may. So please bear with us. We are all animal people after all. Believe it or not, there are estimates that say there could be thousands of primates kept as pets in private homes across the United States. There's a patchwork of state legislation across the country offering various levels of regulation of the trade, ranging from complete bans through species-specific restrictions, permit programs, and in many cases, no controls whatsoever. Not only is this a nightmare for animal welfare, and we'll hear more about that from our expert panel, the trade poses a significant risk to human health and safety. While baby monkeys may seem cute and cuddly, even the smallest of species grow to be dangerous wild animals as adults who can inflict serious injury or spread disease to humans. In the last few weeks, Born Free USA has released a groundbreaking report, Public Danger, Private Pain, which brings together experts in primate welfare, conservation, law enforcement, lobbying, rescue, and rehabilitation. These experts are calling for a permanent end to the dangerous and cruel trade and for the implementation of the Captive Primate Safety Act, a law which would ban private ownership of primates, as well as interstate trade and most direct interactions with primates in public spaces, so for example, in zoos. We are delighted to be joined today by 4 of those experts who will be sharing their experience with us. So we have Katie Conway, the manager of Born Free USA's Primate Sanctuary, close colleague of mine, who brings her expertise in providing care to rescued monkeys following the physical and mental harm caused to them by the pet trade. She may also be joined by our office cat, Huey. Dr. Stephanie Poindexter, Assistant Professor of Evolutionary Anthropology at the University at Buffalo. She'll be talking about the impact of the pet trade on wild primate conservation. We're joined by Tim Harrison, a former first responder who was featured in the documentaries An Elephant in the Room and the recent conservation game, which is out now. You should definitely watch it. It is a real eye-opener about wildlife trade in the US. Tim's going to be talking about his experiences responding to primate escapes and attacks And last but not least, we have Erica Burr, a former primate pet owner, who will speak about her experience of owning a monkey and why she surrendered him, he's called Kai, into the care of our sanctuary where he now lives. So I'm going to start with you, Katie. Starting with the fundamentals. So you've got long-term experience caring for the victims of the primate pet trade. What's wrong with it? What's the problem? What's the issue we're talking about here?
Yeah, so thank you, Liz. The problem with the primate pet trade is that primates are not pets. They're not equipped to handle that kind of life. Only domesticated animals can really be pets because domestication is a process over hundreds of generations of actually changing a species at the genetic level in order to adapt them to living with humans. Primates are not domesticated, they're wild animals. That means that when they're kept as pets, they experience severe physical and psychological stress. It damages them emotionally, it stunts their social development, it causes lasting harm to their minds and their bodies because of the huge amounts of stress that they're under all the time. In addition to that, it's also incredibly dangerous for the humans, as you touched on. When primates start to mature, they naturally try to start asserting themselves and rise in the social ranks. And when they're around humans, that means they start showing aggression. They start biting and scratching. And because they're so strong and their teeth are so sharp, they become unmanageable. So they can, I mean, primates do seriously maim or even kill people. So yeah, I want the primate pet trade banned because the practice is just so traumatic for everyone involved, and there is no reason for a primate to be kept as a pet. There are no benefits to it at all, and it just leads to tragedy all around.
Thanks, Katie. That's a brilliant scene setting for the rest of the conversation that's going to follow. Stephanie, your work's taken you around the world in pursuit of protection and conservation of primate species. Can you talk a little bit about how the illegal trade, sometimes in really far-flung places, connects back to the trade here in the US?
Sure, definitely. I think the main thing is that we are living in a really globalized world and environment, and where an Instagram post taken, in Florida is going to reach an audience much wider than any platform may have, generations prior. And so people are really getting a good sense of what others are doing in different parts of the world. So while it might seem really remote and like there's no connection between South American primate conservation or Asian primate conservation and what is happening here in the US, it really does have a broad reach. Because if you can readily see primates in, homes or with people, that image becomes populated all over the world. And then it drives the desire to have primates as pets. And so, where do you get more and more primates? You can pull them from forests, in their native ranges. And so while those species may not be making it over into the US market, they are populating markets where they are endemic. And so it really just kind of fuels this big monster, to be honest.
Thank you. Moving on to Tim. So Tim, you're coming at this from a slightly different direction than some of us. So you've worked as a first responder in many animal escape emergencies, including the tragedy at Zanesville, which was over a decade ago now, but I think many people will have heard of it. At that time, 56 animals were killed after they were, as I understand it, released by their former owner. How do you respond to that as a first responder? How do you know what to do? What kind of training do you guys receive? How does this play out for you as a first responder?
As a person, as a first responder, not as myself, since I had all that training before I became a law enforcement and police officer, firefighter, paramedic, is that first responders aren't trained. They're not trained in how to handle any dangerous exotic animals or any kind of zoonotic problem or anything of that nature. When they go into these situations, they're going strictly by nothing, no training. They got to think of only public safety. That's it. So they have to, most of the time when people talk about, hey, I want to get a monkey, I tell them, well, let me put it to you this way. You're going to love that monkey to death. Because if it gets out, there's only one thing that's going to happen to that monkey. It's most likely going to be killed. Because when it comes to the police officers, they only have one initiative, and that is to protect public safety. If a primate gets out and is running loose, as in Zanesville with the baboons there, they have to be shot. There's no other way to do it at that time. We had 56 of the most dangerous creatures on the planet turned loose on Zanesville. So the city of Zanesville, as it's probably, I consider it a largest terrorist event when somebody using animals like this as IEDs, as weapons against the community and law enforcement. So when this happens, the law enforcement aren't trained. Nobody's trained to handle these things. They don't have dart rifles. They don't have the, can get ketamine or Rompoon or any of the drugs they need to even dart these animals. And when you get in rural areas like this was at, in Licking County and that area out there in Ohio, you've got no veterinarians out there that even know how to handle some of these animals. So you have a situation where even the zoo was slow to respond. And even when they got there, they don't want to touch any of these things either. So it's one of those responses that it is a public safety hazard to have these animals in your community, but it isn't also an animal hazard because these animals are the ones that are the innocent victims. They're the ones that the law enforcement do not want to kill. And I just was talking to some of the law enforcement gentlemen just earlier on a Zoom call, and they were saying, Tim, make sure people understand this is like killing a human being, a human baby, when you kill a primate, and they go home with tears in their eyes. They do not want to do this. They don't want this to happen. If we had the legislation, we would never have had Zanesville, and we would never have the problems we have right now.
Thank you. And thank you for being on the front line to deal with those things. I think one of the points you just made about, not having tranquilizers, I think also it's worth pointing out that when issues get to that point, when you have animals at large, then tranquilizing isn't going to work anyway, because that takes time to take effect. So even if you do manage to dart an animal with sedation, then they are still running around for some time before, as that takes effect. So it's an inevitable outcome that is going to happen. So thank you for that.
You have a drug crazed animal now running through your neighborhood. You had a regular monkey acting like a monkey. You give it full of ketamine, just what the kids have at their parties, Special K. You're going to end up having an animal seeing lights more bright, seeing things happening quicker. Their neurological system is going to be thrown off, and you've got yourself a problem.
Yeah. So you've got unpredictability on top of unpredictability. Yeah. Okay, moving on to Erica. Erica, so as someone who purchased a pet primate in the past, then later surrendered him to our sanctuary where he's very much loved and very well cared for here. We all absolutely adore Kai. Can you tell us what changed your mind?
Yeah, there were actually several red flags that made me realize that maybe owning a pet primate wasn't the best idea. In the first couple of years, there were lawsuits, court costs, emergency vet visits, and that was during the good years. So around the time that Kai turned 2, he started to get really aggressive towards me, and he had never been aggressive towards me before that. He bit me 3 times in a matter of 2 weeks, and it broke the skin. And that was when I thought, okay, this is not sustainable. I need to find a different solution for this. And so I started reaching out to sanctuaries all across the country trying to find a home for him, and luckily was led to Born Free. But I remember right after I received the email from Born Free letting me know that they would be willing to take him in, I went into Kai's room, and I wasn't spending a whole lot of time in there at that time because I was afraid to be around him. And I sat down on the floor by the door, just real cautious, and he brought his little teddy bear over and he cuddled up in my lap, and I just started crying because I felt guilty for having done this to him. And a tear fell on him, and he looked up and he attacked my face. And that was when I knew that this was the right answer. He needed to be somewhere that professionals that were experienced with caring for primates could take care of him.
Thanks, Erica, and thank you for sharing your story as well. It's really powerful to hear firsthand from someone who's had that experience. And just to follow up on that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in your opinion, he'd lived around you. Do you think there is a way that these animals can be tamed so that they wouldn't do that, or do you think that was inevitable?
Oh, absolutely not. At the time, I really felt like I was doing my best to provide a good and loving home for him. He had his own room. He had a large cage with all kinds of interactive stuff to play with. But looking back, it just looks so sad. There's tarps on the walls. There's tarps over the windows. It's a monkey, a cage, and a TV. That's not a life for anyone. And I feel like I really did everything I could. And it's just not how monkeys are supposed to be brought up.
Yeah, yeah. Katie, so going on, as someone who now cares for Kai on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily talking about Kai, but when monkeys come in as rescues, what happens next? What does recovery look like for them?
Yeah, so when they come in, usually the monkeys that we get in haven't spent a lot of time outside. So they're usually very pale, noticeably weak. Their muscles aren't really developed. A lot of times they're underweight or undersized for their age. They're sometimes they're overly aggressive, or they can be, I have a cat here, and they can be incredibly fearful. And it's pretty much a given that all expats are going to be exhibiting what we call stereotypic behaviors, which are self-comforting behaviors that they've developed because they didn't have healthy outlets to relieve stress. So these are things that can be anything from like rolling their heads to pulling their hair to actually biting themselves. And these are behaviors that are going to stay with them the rest of their lives. So what we try to do is we kind of have to teach them how to be monkeys. Most of them have never met another monkey. They don't really know how to act. We try to slowly introduce them to other monkeys. We let them look at them and smell them and listen to their noises, get closer and closer so that they can start touching each other. We try to give them models who can model appropriate behaviors. Hopefully they can then kind of integrate into either a pair or a group, and they can have some sort of companionship that they've never really experienced. Whether or not they're able to do that, they're able to successfully join in, really depends on the individual monkey and their history. I mean, it's wonderful for us to see a monkey who has never really been in a social situation like that start to groom somebody else and have that really natural and valuable experience that they've never had before. But some of them, they're so damaged that they're never really quite able to figure it out. And of course we keep trying to help them, but it can be a long and difficult road for certain individuals.
Thanks, Katie. And we've had quite the summer of it this year. Katie and I worked together at the sanctuary, and we've had five guys come into us this year, which has been kind of chaotic, but like you say, great to see them start to settle in and get that color on their face. And I think one of the most rewarding things for me is that when they first come, they're often very humanized, so they will focus their attention on people rather than the monkeys, and they might even be scared of the other monkeys. And one of the most rewarding things for us is when basically they start to ignore us, when they're just like, yeah, you're not part of my social group. I'm with my own people now. And they kind of disappear off and they no longer crave that human attention. So that's something that's really wonderful to see.
Yeah, that's actually a victory for us.
Yeah, for sure. When they start ignoring us, that's good news. So going back to you, Erica, I just kind of want to focus a little bit on the process. So how easy was it to get a pet monkey? I don't think I would know where to start if I didn't work in this field and understand where some of them would come from. What did you have to do to get Kai?
I actually heard about this exotic animal auction through a friend of a friend that had a pet baby kangaroo. A whole different story. But it was actually surprisingly easy. My roommate and I drove an hour away to this auction. There was only one baby monkey in the whole thing, and so we decided that was the one we were going to get. That was about as much forethought as I had for this whole process. Mm-hmm. And after the auction, it was a 10-minute discussion with the breeder, and then she handed over this little pet carrier with a monkey and his teddy bear and some formula and said, "Good luck."
Wow. I know when you were interviewed for our report, and I think your exact kind of line was, and you thought, what the hell have I done now?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was surreal being surrounded by, giraffes and zebras and animals I'd never even heard of before. Wow. And then squirrels. You had to have a permit to buy a squirrel, but there were no prerequisites for a monkey. Just show up with money and you can have it. Yeah.
Tim, I see you nodding your head. I know that you've spent times at these auctions. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences there? You know, has your experience been similar to Erica's? And I know you have some interesting stories from those places. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted just now.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, you can see it, and if you just get on Amazon and watch The Elephant in the Living Room, it's for free right now. You'll see the auctions. You'll see the monkeys stacked on top of each other. There's no permits. There's no veterinarians. There's nothing. You walk in, you can get yourself an endangered species and walk out without anything, as you saw TYSON with the conservation game. We even brought it up in that documentary also. Monkeys are so easy to get, and you don't even have to have that. Now we have the internet. You just call up, get on your computer, you'll be at somebody's house, or you can meet them at rest areas, take it from law enforcement. That's the biggest area that people deal with venomous snakes, tiger cubs, things right now, because they don't really want to go to the auctions because they have to give a piece of their money to the Amish or whoever's auctioning at that time. You can actually meet somebody at a rest area along the interstate and go right in and have a transaction right at the interstate. Now, Erica, I've been where you've been. I understand exactly what you're talking about. And that animal did not turn on you. That animal just went monkey. You didn't know any better. What the people, you saw something, and it's called a knee-jerk reaction. I hate to call it a monkey see, monkey do kind of thing, where you see it on TV or see other people having fun with them on Animal Planet and shows like that. You immediately think you can bring that into your home and do the same thing, but that surgically altered animal on TV that's been given something to take the edge off, that you can do the same thing. I found out the hard way. I call it a baptism in reality. We both had it, and now we're here. So now we're able to speak about it, and I've seen it literally hundreds of times over the, maybe thousands over the 47 years I've dealt. Primates are very, very popular.
Absolutely, thank you. And just to highlight, I saw Jenny, who's on the webinar. Hi Jenny, she does incredible work with rescued chimps. So to make the point that this is generally legal. As we say, there is a patchwork of legislation. There's some restrictions, but generally speaking, the reason we're so desperate for this law to come in is because this is legal. This is not kind of shady dealings going on kind of underground. This is a legal trade which is allowed. Now, Stephanie, I want to come back to you. You know, listening to the information about the auctions, I think that's something that perhaps here we have ideas of those kind of things happening in different countries. But it sounds very similar to the work that you've done overseas. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the health risks, both to the animals and to people, with regard to these kind of markets that Tim and Erica are talking about, and I know you've worked in as well.
Sure. So I have visited a few markets while doing field work in different parts of Southeast Asia. And honestly, hearing the description of that animal auction with the primate cages sort of stacked up really high, not really any regard for what's happening in these cages or how precarious these setups might be, really sort of describes what I've seen in different markets. Yeah, it's just sort of this exchange of money and animals, and they're just kind of there to pass through. And it really depends on what species it is, how high the risk of zoonotic disease transfer might be. But people don't know that, right? And so you're sort of passing through all of these different environments. They aren't pristine cages or pristine environments in which, there aren't health risks. And so there's definitely that element involved. And you'll find all sorts of animals. You'll find bats crammed into cages. And we know that there are all sorts of issues involved with zoonotic disease transfer between different bats, different rodents, primates. And so it's really just kind of creating an issue for all of the animals involved, for the people who might be crammed into these spaces. It really just isn't a very safe environment. But that's probably the last thing on their minds, to be honest about it. It's transactional, and so the more you can cram into a space, the more money you might be able to make at the end of the day. But it is definitely a risk.
Absolutely, and I think perhaps something that's come out, a learning opportunity, I guess, that's come out of the past couple of years is that there's now a deeper understanding of zoonotic disease. spread, because obviously COVID is something which originated in other animals. And generally speaking, those risks are created where wild animals are brought in unnatural close proximity to humans. And so hopefully we're moving into a time where people have a better understanding of that. But obviously that doesn't help the individuals who are currently in the trade and who are suffering. So Erica, coming back to you, you talked a little bit about this, but can we get into the reality of owning Kai? How did your kind of expectations of owning him, what were you envisaging when you were thinking about, you know, having a pet monkey, and how did that change, perhaps right from the get-go, but also over time as he did get older? What was the kind of trajectory of buying him and then getting to this decision that you've already talked about of moving him to a sanctuary?
Sure. So when I first adopted Kai, I thought it would be, you know, this fun little cuddly friend that I could dress up, take him to parties and stuff, show him off. I think that was kind of where my head was at that point. And the reality could not be farther from that. I jokingly compared having a pet monkey to being a parent, because it was practice at wrangling a diaper onto a small being that's trying to fight a diaper change. But it is, having kids now, it is so much different. It doesn't even compare. Having a diaper on him was a good day. So dressing him up and little cute, that wasn't a thing. Within a year, I mean, everything I owned was covered in a layer of food goo or worse, or, I mean, if you've ever wanted to spend your Friday night trying to cut poop off of a monkey's tail, maybe, you know, it's just not something that I was warned about before getting a primate. It's disgusting. And by the time he turned 2 and was aggressive towards me, I mean, I really didn't even feel comfortable being in his room long enough to even clean his cage that well. So by the time I was reaching out to Born Free, he was basically in solitary confinement 23 and a half hours a day because I was just scared to be around him.
Yeah. And then that kind of develops into the kind of things that Katie was talking about, is kind of a vicious cycle that we see with, you know, people who with the best of intentions and adore these animals, as you did and do with Kai. And then as they get older, there's just this, you know, what do you do with them? You know, there's so few places that can take them. And some of the examples from this summer, we've brought in a number of monkeys, and Gambit really springs to mind, who I think story is similar to Kai's, that, you know, he was very, very loved. And then he got older, he got more dangerous, he was starting to bite. He was then put in a very small cage, I know you didn't do that to Kai, but he was put in this tiny cage. And it was because his owners were absolutely terrified of him, genuinely terrified. And that was just this vicious cycle where he was then left in this cage, which meant his aggression was just spiraling and escalating. So they would walk past the cage and he would throw himself at it. And eventually they called us and they said, you know, we think he's going to break out and we think he's going to seriously injure us. So it was this awful cycle where nobody was happy. And a lot of the time, you know, our sanctuary is one of around 20 around the country. And realistically, we can take in, on a good year, if we have capacity, we can take in maybe 5 monkeys, because we have to take into account social structures we already have going on, staffing, just space, just having the space, because these animals live for a really long time. So, you know, it's not that we're adopting them out, they can't go anywhere once we've taken them, so we offer them a home for life. So we're kind of regularly at capacity. And just think about so many who didn't take the decision that you took, the right decision to try and find somewhere, and those who do want to take the decision but can't find anywhere for these animals to go. It really is a sort of vicious cycle. So Katie, coming back to you, I know you do. I can already think of a number of individuals who come to mind when Erica speaks about Kai's experience. There are similarities, so many similarities with Erica's account to some of the stories of other rescue monkeys. Are there any individuals that kind of stand out to you that you want to share their stories?
Yeah, I mean, Gambit was the first one that came to my mind when she was talking, because it was exactly the same thing. When he turned 2, he started becoming aggressive, and he started attacking people and biting them. And then, even though they cared for him and loved him, they had to lock him away forever. You know, they couldn't interact with him. There have just been so many. We have this old lady baboon named Betsy, who she was in this backyard cage that was like welded closed for, what was it, like 32 years? Is that how long?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, you know, covered over. She was on this concrete ground. She was so stressed in her youth that she actually ended up self-amputating some of her own toes and part of her tail. So yeah, it's something that we hear these similar stories over and over and over. And I mean, and these are the ones that the people who actually cared about their pets, some of them have been confiscated and taken away because they were being abused. One of the worst stories that I know of is from a little long tail named Freeman, who was kept in a dog crate for 10 years with cement blocks on top of it so that he couldn't get out of it. He was never taken outside. The cage was in a basement. It was never cleaned. So it was just 6 inches of filth under him. I mean, when he finally came to the sanctuary, he had barely had enough room to turn around, and now all of a sudden, you know, he's in this open area and he can see the sun and feel the grass, and it's just, you know, there are just so many and so many different ways that these monkeys have suffered.
Mm-hmm. Tim, yeah, go ahead.
There we go.
Yeah, we got you.
I just want to throw in, I've been through tons too, but the one that stuck in my mind is a lot of times people don't understand, you're not going to get a veterinarian that's going to help you. That's where my organization, Outreach for Animals, would come in. We'd actually do surgeries on lots of primates. We actually have a doctor that actually comes in as a human surgeon for children. It comes in, does hernia operations and things on the people's primates and nobody else. We take care of the animal first, then we try to get them to move it. And we must make sure the animal and the people are safe. But we had a Pattis monkey, as you know, have the longest canines and the fastest primate. Woman had it in her backyard in Indiana. She got it at an auction. And it got too big, escaped. How I got involved, escaped, tacked some kids in sleeping bags in the house, and then bit off their dog's ears. So I got there, I had to get the monkey back in the cage. The reason he was upset, canine had grown through his lower jaw because they didn't understand the canine will continually grow unless he has something to work it down with. So we ended up, now the next step was trying to get the right dental team to come in to work on him. Just so happened we had a doctor who was actual facial reconstructive surgeon and a dental surgeon, human, that came in with 2 veterinarians and redid the jaw and redid the mouth. And we had a process of helping that monkey to find another location. But the whole thing is people, when they buy them, they don't read a book on them. I've been there. You don't read a book. You don't read out how big they're going to get. When they become sexually mature, they don't need you anymore. They don't need anybody except themselves. And you get to a point where you're not paying attention to what you feed them or what they need to have medically wise, or just be able to keep their canines the way they need to stay healthy. So we have a lot of problems with education, even in schools and everybody else. People have a tendency, we read books, you know, Curious George. Every time something comes up, you'll be surprised how many people I talk to at the auctions and stuff undercover. Why are you getting it? Oh, I always loved Curious George. Or if another movie comes out with a capuchin, like the Night in the Opera or Night in the Museum, bingo, we got capuchins all over the place. I can guarantee it. I've been on every radio show and TV show. Next month, we're going to have about 10 capuchins in the area. Boom, right off that movie being premiered. So it's one of those situations where people, I think better education is the way we need to go. And I think you guys do a fantastic job at Born Free. So we need to continue educating before people get these animals and get more respect for them. But yeah, there are some horrible situations out there. I've seen some horrible stuff. And not because the people didn't like their animal, it's because they didn't know how to care for it.
Yeah, and I think there's also an assumption, and this is probably one of the reasons why the trade being legal, I think people think if something's legal, it's okay. They think that someone somewhere has made this kind of conscious decision to say, yes, if it's legal, it's fine. The animal's welfare needs must be met. And I think you don't think about those things. You assume that a vet will be available to care for your pet animal if you have a pet animal legally. We're very lucky here. We have an incredible vet who works with us. But yeah, I mean, they are few and far between, around the country, around the world, who have any kind of expertise with primates at all. It's not part of normal vet training. Stephanie, what Tim was just talking about the kind of influence of media, you touched on it a little bit already. I know you've worked with the Little Fireface project, and that always sticks with me as such a great example of how misconceptions of how primates can be understood or not understood, as the case may be. Are you okay to talk a little bit about that?
No, absolutely. And while Tim was talking, I was just thinking of all of these different things and how like education is very much important, and I think that'll absolutely help. But I think restricting access is what we can do more immediately, and that's why I think this is also incredibly important, because education is the sort of thing that kind of gets rolled out, it's slowly absorbed, and you might be able to change the next generation's perspective on things. I mean, of course, you have instances where people change their opinions now, and I'm not saying that is impossible, but it's definitely a longer term outlook, I think, and like a more immediate way to sort of curb this issue might be through the legislature, which is why I'm really excited about it. But yeah, people do have all sorts of misconceptions about what might happen, and seeing them in the media, seeing them on social media, seeing them in films and movies is all sort of pushing the desire and the misconceptions about what it means to be amongst wild animals. Just hearing the diversity of the species that you all have interacted with in the States is crazy to me. Thinking about a Patis monkey being in someone's backyard. And so that's something that's really remarkable to me. But yeah, in terms of a lot of these species, people who study them specifically, and just primatologists looking at these animals' behaviors and social structures and what they need to survive in the wild, we still don't have all of that information. And so to think that people who might want to put them in a different non-wild context or have them in their homes can do, any sort of a appropriate job in caring for them, it's just, it's not possible. Like, I don't even know all there is to know about slow lorises, and to imagine someone wants to buy one off of the internet, and they can, and they do, it's just a recipe for disaster, honestly. But yeah, there are lots of things that people think go along with seeing them in non-wild contexts, having really big, cute faces. Like, they're so fluffy and cuddly, of course they're going to be lovely and great to have around. But like slow lorises are venomous. That is not a good pet to have at all, no matter how large or cute their face is. It's not something you want to have in your house. And so yes, there are all sorts of misconceptions, and it's hard to try to figure out a route to get people to see the reality. But yeah, I think having less of them in the media, all forms of media, especially in non-wild environments, is going to help people understand that this is, not where they should be. Like, they should not be pets. These are wild animals that are unpredictable in the best of circumstances. Yeah. And so, there's still just a lot of unknowns involved, even in the wild.
Yeah, for sure. Erica.
Stephanie brought up a good point. These primates, they look so cute and cuddly, but keep in mind, I think Kai was maybe 6 pounds, and I was terrified of him. He was still tiny and adorable and terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's not even just physical strength or, his teeth were really sharp. But there was one time I had him at my mom's house, and she had cut up a nectarine to feed to him, and she had just put the knife in the sink like you would. Well, he's not a baby. He can go climb in the sink and grab the knife, and now there's a handful of adults chasing a small primate with a paring knife. And that was terrifying.
Yeah.
So even small, cute, cuddly primates are not good pets.
Yeah, and I think they use their limbs in a different way than we can imagine. So you hear people saying, "Oh, you know, a capuchin is the size of a cat," but a capuchin is the size of a cat, and they can scale a wall faster than you can imagine, and they can jump on you from above, and they can, you know, that all of these things combined. I think one thing that what you were saying, Stephanie, and the things that you don't necessarily read or understand is it always makes me think of the way that we look at grinning primates. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, my internet just dropped out for a second. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, you can. So yeah, when we talk about grinning primates, and obviously grinning for humans generally, I mean, we have those sort of awkward grimaces that we do, but grinning for humans is usually a sign of happiness, or sort of, you know, we're smiling. And it's something that you always see. You see the little chimps on postcards and they've got this grin on their face, but actually that's a sign of vulnerability and anxiety. And I always remember years ago, we'd gone to, a colleague of mine and myself had gone to visit this guy who had 2 capuchins as pets, and one of them had diabetes, and he'd asked us to come and help him. We really wanted him to surrender the animals, but he didn't know how to treat the monkey's diabetes. So we'd gone to visit him in the hope we could get him to hand over the monkeys. He didn't in the end. But he had this capuchin who was chest tugging, which is kind of a greeting, but he was just twittering and he was grimacing constantly, which was showing that he was in this really high state of anxiety. And the guy had had this monkey for like 15 years, and he was sort of in front of the cage and he was grinning back. And this poor animal was trying to communicate with him that he was upset, and it was just escalating. And I think either me or my colleague sort of tapped the guy on the shoulder and said, if you just kind of put your eyes down and look away, he'll stop. And the guy was sort of said, you know, how did you do that? I've never been able to get him to stop doing that. What was it? And we explained, and it seems like such a small thing, but the impact was this animal had spent years in the presence of this guy in this state of really high anxiety because the guy just wasn't reading him correctly. And that was, you know, that was the least of their worries. The guy was also missing a finger because one of them had bitten it off, you know. So there's all of these little things combined which just go to these complex animals living these lives that they just shouldn't be living. Sorry, I'm taking over. So before we finish, I don't know if anybody else has got anything they'd like to add. I can see that there's loads of kind of communication and things coming up from the audience. So if all the participants are okay, if Angela might like to come back, then perhaps we could field some questions from the audience, because it really seems like people are really engaged, which is amazing.
Hello, I'm back.
Hello, you're back.
So we've had some really great questions coming in, and I think, you know, we should have time to get to a few of them here. We've talked a lot about the public safety risk. We've talked about the effects, you know, potential disease transmission, the dangers to humans. And Katie, you talked, you know, very well about kind of the trauma and what happens once they come to a sanctuary. But, you know, one of Born Free's main concerns, you know, is the welfare of the animals themselves. And, you know, Liz, you kind of touched on this, but I'd like to open this up to anyone, perhaps starting with Liz or maybe Stephanie. Just kind of how do these monkeys even get out there? You know, I think what I'm getting at here is, you know, the situation in breeding facilities and what happens to the mothers, because it's not just the babies, there are mothers left behind. So would somebody like to maybe touch on the, you know, the trauma that is experienced in those situations? Tim.
Yeah, I can jump on that real quick because we had a ton of them in Ohio. We had breeding puppy mills for monkeys. We had puppy mills for tigers. We just broke up one, Tigers and Lions here recently with Wildcat Sanctuary up in Minnesota, just right on the border of Indiana and Ohio. The puppy mill for big cats. we had a lot of primates here in the state, and they've kind of moved over into Indiana and over into Pennsylvania now, since we have some substantial laws now in our state. But it's just like a puppy mill. If you went in and asked, just like if you see in the conservation game, you're going to find out, you ain't going to find out who their parents are majority of the time. It's going to be a nightmare of paperwork. A lot of times they don't even care, the breeders and the exploiters, because they don't have to follow any rules. So when you're trying to look to find out, the only way you're going to find out, some inside individual comes out and says, there's a puppy mill at so-and-so's farm, there's a monkey mill over here, and we'll go to that location and we'll be able to find the monkeys. But that doesn't mean that was the same monkeys that you were seeing at the auction, over in the next state, because there's so many primates. As you'll see in the elephant in the living room, we actually did a study with law enforcement and animal control. I just did an animal control seminar, a huge one down in Florida, and they all got stories. They all got stories of big cats and primates and everything. It's like, it's so many you can't keep, and there's no statistics for it out there to follow, really. There's no box to check for a cop when he runs into the situation. That's why we need the legislation. We have legislation that law enforcement can actually do something. We wouldn't have had the Zanesville massacre. We wouldn't have had the 2 chimps running loose in Las Vegas where one was shot. We wouldn't have had Travis in Connecticut. We wouldn't have had the recent one where the chimpanzee was just shot this year. We'll have that taken care of if there's legislation that we're allowed to remove those animals and have proper people like Born Free or organizations to come in and remove those animals from the property legally wise. Then we wouldn't have the problem. So I'm very much with the doctor down there talking about legislation is the only way. That's why I'm working on the Big Cat Public Safety Act. I actually helped put the public safety part onto that. And hopefully the public safety part is going to work with the primates.
Thanks, Tim. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's it's so interesting for me to hear about it from the kind of different perspective. And I guess just to add to that, you were asking Angela as well, that's kind of what practically happens, but what happens to the mothers? What happens to the mothers is that the mothers grieve the loss of their child over and over again throughout their lives. All primates, like humans, have long childhoods. And there's been honestly some horrendous studies over the years about the impact of maternal deprivation on young primates. And it is significant. And that is where those stereotypic behaviors come from. That is why a seemingly very healthy 5-year-old vervet who we rescued this year is showing signs of liver damage, which is a direct physiological response to the extreme stress that she's experienced, because she is an incredibly profoundly social animal who was torn from her mother at a couple of months old. So in terms of the welfare, that's such a huge thing. And as Tim's saying, these are just kind of factories. And every time the mother has the baby taken away, every time the mother suffers and the baby suffers. I'd be really interested, Stephanie, can you add on to that the kind of the wild capture side of things and how that plays into it?
Sure, yeah. So I don't have a lot of experience firsthand in seeing wild captures, but having studied, primate conservation and understanding that these primates are not producing litters like puppies will. And so in order to sustain the demand, you have to continuously and widespread have a plan to take these individuals out of the forest. And natural instincts might kick in from their mothers in which they don't want that to happen. And so then you have all of these other individuals that are involved and become collateral damage as you're seeking to get young primates that can be then taken into the market. And I have a memory of working at a rescue center. It must have been like 6 or 7 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. But one of the vets had a pet loris. And when they found out that that's what I was studying, they were like, oh, we've got one of those. And I asked them, well, what about the mother? And she's like, oh, well, I'm their mother now. And so there is sort of this disconnect. And it was just so interesting because they were surrounded by all of these wild animals that, for me, it's really, amazing and things that I'd never seen before. But depending on where you are, everyone's going to have a different perspective or a different relationship with the wildlife around them. But yeah, it's you can never just go in and precisely extract the babies from wild primates and then carry on. There's going to be individuals who are killed in the process to get to the commodity that you want, which is in most cases the baby.
Tim, you touched on law enforcement kind of needing a partner like Born Free and other sanctuaries. You know, if law enforcement has the ability, you know, the legal ability to remove animals, they need to go to a sanctuary. But yet, Liz, earlier you mentioned how Born Free and many other sanctuaries often operate at capacity. And, you know, and we had a question about kind of the process and the costs and the difficulties of rescuing monkeys. And Liz, I wanted to know if you wanted to talk about one of our rescue stories, or just generally, you know, the cost of building an enclosure at a primate sanctuary that is a suitable enclosure that can be a lifelong home.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I can give you like a secret heads up, because I don't think we've talked about him publicly. So this is a sneak peek of something that's happening in the coming weeks. We actually rescued a little guy a couple of weeks ago. He's called Willis. He came from Chicago. He'd been confiscated. He was kept illegally, and he was confiscated by Chicago Animal Control and Care in conjunction with the Chicago police. He was then taken to animal control. So the dog pound, he was at the dog pound. He was a monkey. They didn't know what to do with him. They do wonderful work, but they do not work with monkeys, and they don't have that experience. The Sanctuary Network gets involved. I get a call to see if we can take him. They're in Chicago, we're in Texas. This is a really complex operation. We happen to have a space for this little guy. And that space had been relatively newly built. It cost about $5,000 because it was an extension to an existing enclosure. But if we were building from scratch, you are looking at, I would say, around $50,000 absolute minimum to build something from scratch to provide a home. So we worked with CACC. Angela actually went down. Angela's based in Chicago. She went down to advise them on what to do. It was kind of one of those things, it takes a village. There was a generous donor who paid for his flight, so there's $1,000 gone already. There was the staff time, resources of CACC, of Chicago Police Force, who dealt with the actual confiscation, which went on over days and various visits. He's now come to us. He's, knock on wood, doing great. We're hoping to introduce him to other monkeys in the coming weeks, but we've now taken on the financial responsibility for a 4-year-old monkey who may live until he's 26. He's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars to us, and it feels very callous to put these lives in those terms. Of course, he is far more to us than the cost it's going to make, but ultimately we rely on the generosity of donors. And so even if we had more capacity, even if we had extra enclosures, there is a limit to what we can do. So while this trade continues and continues and continues, we are only ever putting a Band-Aid over the bullet hole. You know, what Tim's saying about shutting down the breeders so that we can stop it at the source. And then at least we've got hope, you know, but right now, while it continues, while it's legal, this is something that is just simply unsustainable for these individuals to have good outcomes. It's as simple as that.
Yes, well, that's a perfect segue to really what the solution is. And that is the Captive Primate Safety Act. It's also the Big Cat Public Safety Act in the case of those species. So would somebody like to talk about what is the Big Cat Public Safety Act? What would it do? And how can the people listening and the people in the public help support it?
Tim, go for it.
I guess I probably should. So I just got back from Washington, D.C. for the upteenth time. But the Big Cat Public Safety Act is basically a situation where you can't have private breeders anymore. You can't pay to play. You can't have situations where you take them out, the zoos take them out in the public. As you can see with the Columbus Zoo after the conservation game, they immediately got rid of everybody at their zoo, replaced everybody, lost accreditation because they should have. It's time to rebuild. But the one thing is that with the Big Cat Public Safety Act, we're not going to have any more people, private ownership, no more private breeding, no more ability to get to pay to play, get your photos taken with them. The cats come first. sanctuaries like through GFAST, the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance, which all I have to do is make a phone call now before the elephant in the living room. It wasn't that way. I could call up and just say, hey, we got cats over here, boom. They'll find someplace for it. And that's why I love the idea of these legislations, because once we get us as a team with these primates too, all you gotta do is make a phone call. If you don't have room, we'll find somebody that does that, that we don't throw it back in the frying pan. Because the tiger we had in downtown New York that was up in Harlem in the apartment building, we all remember that. The police had to take it out, not the zoo, it was the police. And the guy went down the side of the wall, risked his life, took it out, and they raised their hand in Ohio. The sanctuary in Ohio said, sanctuary with quotation marks, I'll take that tiger back. It's kind of Freudian slip, wasn't it? Back? Well, that cat actually came for auction in Ohio. And that guy took it all the way back to New York. So it went from the frying pan right back into the frying pan, because attorneys and the legislation, or the attorneys and the people there in New York didn't know any better. So they just say, oh yeah, give it to whatever sanctuary wanted it or place wanted it. We don't want that to happen to primates, and we don't want that to happen to big cats anymore. So it's real easy. And then with the Columbus Zoo, just the threat of this law coming through, now they're supporting it. Now they weren't. Now they're supporting big cat public safety. They're not taking big cats, and what else, Liz? They're not taking primates out anymore into the public. So they're ready for y'all. They know it's coming. They know it's a domino effect. Because once the Big Cat Public Safety Act, you were there, Liz, they were eating it up, weren't they? Watch, the world is changing right now. Let me ask you guys a question. I hate to sound me on a soapbox. Do you ever think that people would be against orcas at SeaWorld? No. You ever think that the Ringling Brothers would stop, you know, with their elephants and stuff? No, not in my lifetime. Y'all changing the world. And we know that the young people are ripe for this right now. And we need to just keep pushing it. I'm sorry I got on my soapbox, but that's
what we've got you here for, Tim.
We all have a soapbox to stand on.
That's
and
true.
You know, yeah, so with big cats and the Captive Primate Safety Act, which would, you know, ban the interstate commerce, ban private possession, ban the breeding and sale, and limit, you know, almost ban, but severely limit public contact with these animals, is really the solution. You know, as I said at the start, sanctuaries aren't the solution. Training law enforcement isn't the solution. What's going to protect these animals in the wild, what is going to end the cruelties that they suffer throughout their life from birth and, you know, throughout their progress, is simply that it doesn't happen in the first place. So I know we're getting very close to wrapping up, and I just want to thank everyone for being here today. We will be following up with all of the attendees. Liz, I see you would like to jump in.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say very quickly, of course, thank you to all of the panelists, but I've seen it come up and I wanted to say the same thing to Erica in particular. Thank you for sharing your story. It's brave to come, you know our position on it. I'm really grateful that you're working with us, because I think your testimony is so important. So thank you. And I know a lot of the attendees have said the same thing. They're just really grateful for you sharing that story, because it is a vital component to this campaign. So yeah, I wanted to thank everyone, but in particular, Erica. I'm done now. Thanks, Angela.
That's great. Yes, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think this was a really well-rounded perspectives, many perspectives on how on what this trade impacts, you know, throughout the globe. We will be following up with an email. We'll have a recording of this. We'll also be sending you a link so that you can contact your own representatives or senators to show your support and say, hey, I'm your constituent. I want you to support these bills. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us today, and especially to our panelists. And please visit bornforusa.org for more information. Thank you all.